Welcome to session 3 of our introduction to the Gospel according to Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. I think everyone with us in person and or on Zoom has been with us already, so you've probably been through this at least once. But just for those who are watching this perhaps via recording, if you haven't seen or heard sessions 1 or 2, they would be valuable to you. We are kind of starting at the beginning and marching forward. So tonight we're going to cover the ending of Luke. And so you might want to check out the beginning and the middle of Luke first. This presentation will assume that you've already engaged with that material. Thanks for being with us. My goal is to keep this at an hour or less. And this one I feel quite confident that we're there. But I will be happy to stay around afterwards for as long as you want for further discussion and for further questions. Again, as I covered in the first session and reiterated last time, this is an introduction. And it's a summary, so we do skip over a lot. We do miss a lot. This is not meant to be a comprehensive, in-depth analysis of either of these texts, but rather that summary introduction that will hopefully inspire you to go read the text directly yourselves. There is no replacement for just reading the text themselves. All of that said, let us begin. So in session 1, I talked about the fact that Luke does have a narrative structure. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that narrative structure is retained throughout the whole text. However, I pointed out in session 1 that the beginning of Luke, the first 4.5-ish chapters, right up through the beginning of chapter 5, is very narrative in structure. It's very plot-based, very plot-centered. Events are happening that move the narrative forward moment by moment. Each paragraph, each little passage and section of the text moves the plot along. There's a story. Once we enter chapter 5, all the way through the end of chapter 21, which we covered last week, there still is narrative, technically, but it's much sparser and much less happens. For the most part, all that happens is Jesus travels around, right? He travels west, he travels east, and mostly he travels south towards Jerusalem. Of course, his story will culminate in Jerusalem. So there is a narrative to that long middle section, but not a lot happens in the plot. There aren't a lot of events that advance the narrative. In many ways, it's a holding period narratively so that Luke can spend time mostly focusing on Jesus's teachings, as well as accounting for many of his actions, especially his healings, which are predominant in Luke. Tonight, as we enter chapter 22, we're going to rejoin the narrative. Rejoining the narrative. The one thing that we are going to want to keep track of in that middle section, though, the sort of plot development that does happen, and we'll touch on 2 specific passages that I do want to address before we move into chapter 22 proper. The main thing that happens narratively, as Jesus teaches, and in fact, as he heals as well, he engenders conflict with authorities, especially religious authorities in Israel. There are a lot of Jewish teachers and some priests who don't like what Jesus is up to. They don't like some of his teachings, and they're concerned about some of his behaviors, especially when he, for example, heals someone on the Sabbath, because he's working on the Sabbath, and that's sort of one of the big no-nos of Torah. So although not a lot happens narratively, there's a growing tension from beginning to end. Jesus is encountering more resistance and more hostility, really, though, not from everyone in general, but just from some teachers, some religious teachers, people like me, basically. Religious authorities don't like that he's stirring up trouble and asking some questions and perhaps giving people different ways of understanding their faith. That'll obviously be important as we enter into the final section of the Gospel of Luke. And as we re-enter chapter 22, we will enter a section of the text that is very narrative. Again, the plot will move very quickly. We hear far less from Jesus. We do hear from him far less, and instead we hear what happens around him, and especially what happens to Jesus. Jesus moves from being the agent, the one who's doing the stuff in the middle of the text. He becomes much more passive in the final 3 chapters. And indeed, that's one of the reasons that we talk about the passion of Christ, right? An old Latin word that means to be acted upon. Jesus is an object rather than a subject in those final chapters until the big surprise ending. Right? More on that in a bit. But first, there is an interlude. There are 2 parts that I've grouped with the closing narrative that do actually happen earlier in the text. That is, they are placed within that middle section of Luke, but I think they're better grouped with the closing narrative. That is the Transfiguration, and the entry into Jerusalem, which we remember on Palm Sunday liturgically here in the church. Transfiguration is in chapter 9, and the entry into Jerusalem, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, happens in chapter 19. So they're within that chapter 5 to chapter 21 framework, but I've grouped them with the end because I think that they actually belong narratively with the ending. Apart from them, more or less, the narrative really doesn't pick up again in serious, full earnest until chapter 22. Now, let's start with the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration, in one sense, isn't deeply narrative. In other words, it seems that the Transfiguration could have happened earlier or later, and it wouldn't have done violence to the story. And if you can take an event in a story and move it forward or backward and it makes sense, that's a good indication that it's not really narratively anchored, right? It may say something important, but it's not doing a lot of work in the story. Things that are important to a story tend to matter where you place them in the order of events. The Transfiguration, of course, Jesus goes up a mountain. He goes up there with Peter, James, and John, and there's this strange experience. His face begins to glow. Moses and Elijah, two Jewish prophets who are long dead, appear there, and a voice speaks from heaven. The Transfiguration, on the one hand, isn't narratively anchored. It could happen earlier or later, and it would have made sense. It's in chapter 9. If it had been in chapter 6 or 7, it probably would have been fine. If it had put in chapter 16, it would have been fine. On the other hand, though, many scholars see in the Transfiguration something that's very important to the narrative, because it links Jesus both to the past and to the future. Those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew Bible, perhaps you took our crash course in the Hebrew Bible last year, will remember that there's a very similar scene in the book of Exodus, and actually similar scenes in other texts as well. For example, the story of Elijah. But especially this resonates with the story of Moses. Moses goes up Mount Horeb in Sinai, encounters God there, receives the law, and indeed, eventually Moses' face starts to glow and he actually veils it. So there's clear resonance with this early story. So on the one hand, this story is linking Jesus to Israel's past. Jesus is like Moses, a prophet, someone you can trust. On the other hand, some people have also seen in the Transfiguration something that sounds rather similar to a resurrection appearance. Jesus is glowing. Things are happening that don't make a lot of sense. And in some versions of the resurrection narrative, especially actually in Matthew more than in Luke, Jesus appears on a mountain in northern Israel rather than in Jerusalem. So there's also a sense in which this almost feels like a prefiguration of the resurrection. So it links Jesus to the past and it links Jesus to the future, but it's not really anchored in its present. But I thought it's worth mentioning here because it can be seen as that prefiguration of what is to come. And in fact, Jesus, during the Transfiguration, sort of tells the disciples, look, don't mention this until later, until after my work has been fulfilled, and then it will make sense to you. And indeed, they don't understand what's happening until later. So I think it's linked kind of more with the future, although as it said, it has this kind of connecting from past to future element. Palm Sunday is obviously much more narrative. Jesus has been traveling all over Israel, mostly heading south from Galilee, where he grew up, south to Jerusalem, the political and religious center of Jewish life, without question. Obviously, he has to actually enter Jerusalem. And the way that the story is structured, once he enters Jerusalem, he's not going to leave. So this is a one-way journey. And so Palm Sunday, unlike the Transfiguration, has to happen when it happens. If you move this a few chapters earlier, that would be a problem because Jesus wouldn't be free in the countryside teaching. And obviously you can't move Jesus's entry into Jerusalem after he's been killed in Jerusalem. So this event is very narrative. So it occurs a little earlier than we kind of want it in one sense for a nice clean break. If it occurred at the end of 21, that would work better for my analysis of the text. But I think obviously it's grouped best with the closing section of Luke. And again, it does link Jesus to the past. The fact that Jesus rides in on a donkey is fulfilling a prophecy that's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible about the Messiah to come will ride either a young colt or a donkey into Jerusalem in order to become king. But this is sort of the dividing line between that period of Jesus's life where he's teaching, and now he enters Jerusalem and the plot quickens, thickens, and he becomes, again, not the agent, but rather the object of what's happening. And here's a very modern rendition of the Transfiguration. I don't know, does this qualify as impressionist? I don't know art very well. Does anyone know? Ellen, you feel like you might know this. Maybe, really loosely. This isn't an art history class. I'm not even remotely qualified. Kinshasa would probably be scolding me and it would give me a better definition. But I like the.
I would say it's impressionist, Scott.
Thank you.
I think, yeah.
Well,
I mean,
if Kinshasa yells
like
at me, I'll blame you.
I think Stephanie would say it's maybe post-impressionism, but I would say it's impressionist.
Oh, I like post-impressionist. That sounds vague enough too. I mean, a lot of things could technically be post-impressionist, right? So there you go. But I like it, right? I like that it doesn't aim for a kind of literal spectacle of the event, but points rather to the strangeness of what these people encountered. All right, now let's get into the final 3 chapters proper. Now, Jesus had predicted his death at various points throughout that middle section of Luke. I've got some scriptural passages there. And again, those are not necessarily exhaustive. I think there may be other places too, but those are definitely 3 places. Twice in chapter 9 and again in chapter 18, Jesus predicted what's coming. He's been warning his disciples that violence is in his future. And of course, they largely didn't want to hear that, not surprisingly. But once he actually enters Jerusalem, and he's entering ahead of the festival of Passover, the festival of unleavened bread, certainly one of the most important high feast days within Judaism. His entrance into Jerusalem sets in motion this process of his arrest and execution. And once he enters, it begins and it kind of happens without his involvement. He has to sort of choose to cross that threshold, but once he crosses the threshold, those events kind of jump into action. So chapter 22 opens with a plot by a group of religious leaders, a few priests and a few, I think it says scribes. It might say teachers or scribes. I have to double check the language. So a small group of priests and religious teachers who are deeply concerned both with Jesus's teachings, but also with his violation of the Sabbath and some other basic rules. They want to get rid of Jesus. They see him as dangerous, perhaps dangerous to the integrity of their faith, but they also probably think that Jesus could eventually get them in trouble with the Roman authorities. They see a double danger, both internal and external. And they decide to go ahead and figure out how to get him arrested and turned over to Roman authorities. Jesus's disciple Judas conspires with them and agrees for payment to let them know where Jesus is going to be so that they can sort of ambush and arrest him. We are not told within Scripture Judas's motivation, although historians and scholars have speculated about that afterwards. I'm happy to talk about that afterwards, but I won't belabor that now. Meanwhile, though, Jesus is continuing his work. He instructs his disciples to find a place for them to share the Passover meal in an upper room of a small house in Jerusalem. And it's there where Jesus has his last meal, which we, of course, remember as the capital L, capital S, Last Supper. And this is actually where Jesus institutes what we now know as the Eucharist, right? Jesus hasn't had this kind of meal with his disciples yet, where he says the words that he'll say here. And this is actually where we get the language. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So when you hear me recite those words on the Sunday, I am directly quoting Jesus, right? From the Gospel of Luke. We also have references to this, of course, in the other Gospels. Paul also makes reference to this in some of his letters. And again, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. This is both in chapter 22, and the verses are there on your screen if you wanted to look into that. But again, last week I suggested that we ought to think of Jesus primarily as a teacher, and indeed Jesus cannot help himself. Even at this late hour, he is still teaching. The first lesson that he gives is he notices that his disciples are still fighting over who has the most prestige within their group. Who gets to be the leader? Who gets to sit, alluding to a previous passage of the Gospels, who gets to sit at Jesus's right hand? And Jesus essentially scolds them and talks to them about the fact that in his community, those who wish to lead must instead serve. Now, this is the moment in the gospel according to John where Jesus will wash their feet and reinforces his verbal lesson with a physical example. We don't get the foot washing in Luke. That's in John. But it's that same moment of the meal, and presumably Luke doesn't include that for whatever reason, but it's the same moment of the meal. And of course, the same lesson is being given. Next, Jesus teaches about the need to be ready. He talked about having your bag and your sword ready to travel, ready to move. He's trying to reinforce to his disciples, to his students, that things are about to get really rough and dangerous, and they need to be ready to move. Thus far, they've just sort of been wandering around with Jesus. And although Jesus seems to be sensing danger, he's been predicting his death. His disciples don't seem to really get that they're on a collision course with the powers that be, both religious and political. But Jesus is trying to remind them of this reality. Right? 22 is a somewhat longer chapter, so a second slide, so the text wasn't too small. After this meal, Jesus heads to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. This garden is sort of just, I think, if I got my memory correct, just to the east of the city, kind of on the outskirts of the city. I think today Gethsemane is entirely surrounded by modern Jerusalem, but at the time, the city was much smaller. Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives. Now, as I have already said, Jesus understands what his fate is. He understands that he has confronted political and institutional power, and that when you confront institutional power, it responds with violence. He knows that. He understands that. But it's worth noting that here in Luke, he still hopes to avoid this fate, which of course he does. Jesus is divine, but he's also human. He's a human being. He doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to suffer. Who does? And so he goes to the garden with some of his disciples, and he asks them to pray, quote, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." This is not the place where Jesus actually teaches the Lord's Prayer. That happens in the middle section of Luke. But he's mirroring that same language from the Lord's Prayer. It's appropriate because he's reinforcing that lesson, but of course, he himself is about to come into the time of trial. And indeed, Jesus himself will pray that he won't come under this violence, that this cup may pass from him, using this metaphor, the cup here standing in for the violence to come, the cup holding his blood. But that prayer is not answered, at least not in the way that perhaps Jesus hoped, or that one might hope. Instead, Jesus is arrested there in the garden by essentially temple guards or temple police. So these are not Roman guards. These are guards or police that are under the authority of the priests at the temple. Judas told them where Jesus and his disciples would be. And even here, though, again, Jesus has an opportunity to heal and to teach, right? He doesn't give up even now. During the struggle, some of his disciples fight back, and they famously cut off the ear of one of the priest's slaves. Jesus tells him to quit it, and he reaches and heals the man's ear. Again, healing, which we've seen before, and also trying to teach, again, what is the right mode of action? How does one respond to violence? Jesus reiterating, both in this case, not in his words, but in his actions, don't respond to violence with violence. Now, things are starting to get real now, right? The disciples may not have taken Jesus's warning seriously before, but now they realize that he was being very honest and very serious. People are getting arrested, people are fighting, and Peter, the supposed rock of the church, immediately begins denying even knowing Jesus. Now, in the Gospel of John, Peter's 3 denials are kind of spread out across chapters 18 and 19, but in Luke, he just recounts them one after the other. But it shows that Peter, even someone who clearly really wants to be faithful and a good disciple, loses his nerve when confronted by violence, right? And again, perhaps disappointingly, but also understandably. And indeed, Jesus had predicted this earlier in chapter 22. Now, first, Jesus is brought to the Sanhedrin, which is actually a sort of council of priests and religious scholars. And of course, they are the ones who have been opposing Jesus from the outset. They were involved in kind of coming up with this plot to remove Jesus, who they find both religiously and politically inconvenient. They ask Jesus some sort of formal questions, but they already know why they've arrested him. They famously ask Jesus if he considers himself to be the Messiah. He doesn't offer a direct answer. We talked last time about Jesus's approach to teaching, and he brings a similar approach in his answers to this interrogation. He simply says, "You say that I am." He won't even say yes, but he says, "You say that I am," because he knows that they're not asking him a serious question, so he refuses to give a serious answer. But that is enough for them. They consider this blasphemy worthy of capital punishment. But here's the thing. Because they are under Roman occupation, the Sanhedrin, despite their religious authority, they do not have the authority to actually execute capital punishment upon anyone. Instead, they have to get the Roman authorities to do this. So they're essentially charging him with a crime under Jewish law, but they go to the Roman state to actually have a punishment for that crime executed. Pontius Pilate is the governor of the Roman province of, I think at this point it's called Judea, but it changes names over time. At one point it's called Palestine. Its boundaries shift and move, but he's essentially the Roman governor over more or less Israel. It's a little bit complicated. King Herod is up in the north, and so has some independence, but independence is the wrong word. Herod also answers to Pontius Pilate. Pilate answers to the emperor, but there's a complicated sort of districting system for how the Romans break up their different territories. Pilate is the main Roman authority in this region. Pilate asks Jesus a few questions, but Pilate doesn't seem particularly interested in Jewish law, doesn't really understand Jewish law, and doesn't really care what these Jewish folks are fighting about, either Jesus or the priests and the scholars. So Pilate doesn't see a reason to punish him, doesn't seem to find him a threat to Roman power, and that's all he cares about. But of course, Pilate doesn't want to let this guy go. He turns out to be some kind of Jewish rebel and causes trouble. When he finds out that Jesus is actually from Galilee, from the northern territories, he sends him to King Herod, who is a Jewish king who's ruling over Galilee, but who's under Roman authority. So Jesus is sent to Herod, who I think is in town because of Passover. Herod at first is actually enthusiastic. He's heard about Jesus, and he's interested in hearing about Jesus's teachings. Now, in some of the other Gospels, we've had sort of more encounters where Herod is more part of the story and has had conflicts with John. Exactly how the conflicts between Herod and John the Baptist go are different depending on which Gospel you read. In any event, Luke tells us at this point that Herod is actually interested in hearing from Jesus, and indeed hopes that Jesus will perform a miracle. It's worth pointing out that Luke uses the word sign. I mentioned this last time. Jesus, though, refuses to engage Herod's questions. He's sort of evasive, just like he was with the Sanhedrin and with Pilate, and Herod quickly just tires of this and turns on Jesus. Herod just sends Jesus back to Pilate. Doesn't want to deal with the situation either, doesn't want to get in the middle of this. It's pretty clear that Jesus is very unpopular among a small number of religious leaders. But the evidence, of course, is that Jesus is actually pretty popular among the common people of Jerusalem and Israel in general, as we'll talk about, as we'll see. And that's a dangerous thing for a politician to get involved in, right? Someone who a few elites dislike, but the people in general actually like quite a bit. Who do you side with there? What's the politically safe thing to do? It's not clear to Herod or to Pilate. So they're just trying to avoid getting committed and perhaps caught in a disagreement that they don't really understand. Ultimately, though, Jesus is sentenced to death by Pilate, although Pilate himself says that he doesn't think Jesus should be convicted or condemned. But notice that despite the fact that Pilate doesn't think that Jesus has done anything wrong, he condemns him to death anyway, which shows the kind of cowardice of this supposed leader, right? The Roman government, at the end of the day, is concerned about making safe choices. And in this case, simply eliminating Jesus is the safer move. Now, the Sanhedrin are certainly pressuring Pilate, and they've gathered a crowd, presumably of their supporters, right outside the palace, who are pressuring Pilate to execute Jesus. Now, I want to pause for a moment, because this moment in the story of Jesus's crucifixion has been used by some Christians in the past as a justification for anti-Semitism, right? There's some Christians who have paused here and said, hey, there are Jewish people who were arguing for the death of Jesus. And certainly there were some Jewish people who were opposed to Jesus and indeed were trying to get him executed. But many Christians, especially in Europe over the centuries, went from saying, well, there were a few people who were Jewish who did this, to actually blaming this event on the Jewish people as a whole. And this, of course, has been a justification used for anti-Semitic violence in Europe for about the last 1,000 years. And it has contributed to anti-Semitism right up until the present day. So it's really important for us Christians to pause and note here what is and what isn't happening, right? There's a small group, basically, of religious leaders, priests, people like me, who are not at all representative of the Jewish people then or now. They were conspiring against Jesus for their own reasons. But we never should fall into the error of somehow saying that the Jewish people as a whole condemned Jesus. In fact, let's remember, Christians seem to forget this a lot, that Jesus is Jewish, right? His disciples are Jewish. His friends are Jewish. His allies are Jewish. There are a whole lot of Jewish people who disagree with this, who are standing with Jesus. And actually, there are probably a majority of Jewish people who don't even really know who Jesus is and don't really care one way or the other, just not involved in this debate. This sort of conflation where the text will talk about, quote, the Jews doing something, happens more in the Gospel of John, actually, than here. But I just wanted to note it. It's really important that we iron this out and get this straight as Christians reviewing our own text, that we don't make this mistake that for about 1,000 years, Christians have been making a lot, right? There's a specific group of Jewish people who are in conflict with Jesus and who absolutely are trying to get the Roman state to kill him. The vast majority of Jewish people are not involved whatsoever. So I just want to make that super clear, right? And as we will see actually at this moment, a lot of the people in Jerusalem are mourning Pilate's decision. As Jesus walks to Golgotha, a lot of people are beating their breast in a sign of lament that this is a terrible thing that's happening. So a huge number of Jewish people in the town disagree with what's going on. They're just not the powerful people, which is often the case, right? The mass of people don't have the power to do what they want. But the narrative does move really quickly here. Soon we actually have Jesus on the cross, and while he's on the cross, Jesus asks God to forgive those who are persecuting him. There are two thieves being crucified with him. One of them is sort of making fun of Jesus. The other, however, kind of repents for his crimes and asks Jesus to sort of allow him to enter the kingdom, and Jesus assures him that he will be saved. The Roman soldiers who are there at the foot of the cross, who are actually executing the execution, they cast lots for Jesus' clothing, which fulfills a prediction from Psalm 22, verse 18. So again, there's a linkage to the past. There's an attempt to link predictions from Hebrew scripture to these events. And according to Luke, Jesus' final words are, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Now, Jesus' last words differ between the different gospels. This is how Luke records it. The chapter 23 ends with Joseph of Arimathea comes and retrieves Jesus' body and puts Jesus' body in a tomb that presumably belongs to Joseph. It's been freshly hewn out of the rock, a sort of cave tomb, and Jesus' body is laid there. Now, this is presumably happening on like late Friday afternoon, which means that we're just about to hit the Sabbath. And one of the things you can't do on a Sabbath is prepare a body for burial. That's definitely work. And it also involves touching a dead body and probably getting blood on your hands. And those are all things that would make you ritually impure for a variety of things you want to do on the Sabbath. So we kind of have a pause. Nothing happens on Saturday. Jesus' disciples take the Sabbath as they normally would. Despite the fact that Jesus has perhaps been getting them to question exactly how to practice Sabbath, they don't do anything on Saturday. So, chapter 24. Oh, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Here's a famous image of Jesus on the cross. And with this plaque in, I think actually Aramaic, not Hebrew, I think Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, it says Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The crime for which Jesus is officially punished is for claiming to be a king. And if Jesus is a king, then he must be opposed to the rule of the Roman emperor. That supposed reason for his execution is made clearer in John than it is in Luke. But nevertheless, here you are. So the final chapter, right at the end of Luke, you've made it. Chapter 24 opens with a group of women. We're later told it's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and another Mary. There's lots of Marys in the New Testament. Mary, mother of James. They're traveling to the tomb to actually prepare Jesus's body, presumably for a funeral and then a full and final burial. But you all probably already know this part. They show up at the tomb. Jesus's body is missing. And instead, now again, the events at the empty tomb vary between the four Gospels. In Luke, we have two messengers who are there instead. They announce that Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. The women are rather astounded. They run back and tell the male disciples this. And what we're mostly told is that the men don't believe them, right? They don't believe the women. Peter, though, isn't sure, and he runs to the tomb and finds it empty. Now, I don't think Peter has any experience of an angelic vision, but he sees the empty tomb, so he knows something is up. It's worth pointing out that the first people that know anything about this are women, and no one believes them. It's worth thinking about. We jump then in the narrative to two men we've never met before. We're just told that they're sort of Jesus's group. Two disciples, one named Cleopas and another is unnamed. Now, these are not of the 12, but again, we have the sort of the core 12 of Jesus's disciples, but there's a larger movement of people who are following Jesus. They are leaving Jerusalem, going to a town named Emmaus. Jesus has been killed. Their hope in him has been dashed. They thought he was the Messiah. Presumably he ain't. So they're leaving. They're going back home, going back to their farms or wherever their work is to resume life. As they travel, they meet a stranger along the way. They explain to the stranger what's happened to Jesus, and they explain that they've lost their hope and they're giving up. And he kind of critiques them, and he begins to teach them the meaning of Scripture. When the New Testament talks about Scripture, it's talking about the Hebrew Bible, right? Luke hasn't been written yet. The New Testament hasn't been written yet. But he teaches them about the Hebrew Bible and explains that actually the crucifixion is all sort of part of the plan, as it were. They're amazed by his teaching. They decide to stop either at their home or maybe on an inn along the way. They decide to share a meal with him. He sits down for the meal. He blesses the bread. He breaks the bread. This might sound familiar. When he breaks the bread, though, all of a sudden it's revealed that the stranger is, in fact, Jesus. I guess he was shape-shifting or something. We're not told how it is that they didn't recognize him. But they didn't recognize him, and then he just disappears. A very strange narrative. Now, these two men had already heard from the women that the tomb was empty. In fact, they told the traveling stranger that while they were walking along the way. Next, we're brought to the sort of the group of the main disciples who were still in the upper room, presumably the same room where they had the Last Supper. They're kind of hiding out from the authorities, right? Excuse me. Jesus just sort of appears in the room. We're not told that he walks into the room. He just sort of shows up there. He is physically there. He asks to eat some fish. They see him. They experience him. Luke is quick to point out that when they weren't seeing a ghost, he was physically there. They can't explain how this is possible, but there he is. A very strange occurrence. And then it's worth pointing out, right? Jesus starts to teach them again about the meaning of what is happening. Then the chapter ends, and the Gospel of Luke ends with a very short account of the ascension after a short period of time. And in Luke, it's pretty much like he shows up in the upper room, and then he walks out and the ascension occurs. Again, the different, depending on how you want to read various accounts, you might try to imagine this time frame differently. But the way that Luke says it, he's not clear about the time between this appearance in the upper room and the ascension. But after some indeterminate period of time, Jesus sort of walks outside of Jerusalem and disappears again, but now doesn't reappear anywhere. Very strange occurrences, to be sure. And this is how Luke ends. And here's a traditional Greek icon of the road to Emmaus. And of course, we see that this is Jesus. We know because it looks like Jesus, and he's got the cruciform nimbus around his head, right? The cool special halo. But presumably, the two men don't see that it's Jesus as they're walking, right? So this is the ending of Luke, the Ascension. There's a rapid-fire narrative of 3 chapters, ending with the resurrection and ascension, and we're done. Luke is over. And it could stand like this, and it's worth pointing out that the other gospels end here, and as far as we know, they were written to end here. But as I've already said, right, the vast majority of scholars think that the same author wrote Acts, and indeed that the author of Luke and Acts wrote them as sort of companion texts. They can each stand alone. You could read them separately and not read the other. But Acts will pick up exactly where Luke left off. And as we'll see next week, Acts gives us another slightly different version of the ascension and then moves forward. So they actually overlap ever so slightly narratively, and then Acts moves forward. Before we move on to Acts next week, I thought it'd be worth reflecting a little bit on Luke. Now, I'm going to save my full reflections on this for our last session. I want to look at Acts and Luke together and reflect further. But just on Luke itself, it is worth, of course, pausing and reflecting on what we've learned in Luke. I know I've beaten this point into the ground, but I've suggested that Luke is structured narratively, but that it's important to note that the 2/3 of the text that's in the middle of Luke is really not very narratively driven. And I draw attention to that because I really think if we're going to hear and understand Luke's message, we need to hear Jesus as a teacher, take Jesus's teaching seriously, take Jesus's teaching seriously one by one, spend some time with them, reflect deeply on them. They're short, pithy teachings, whether parables or questions or more straightforward teaching like the Sermon on the Plain. Each of them is worth careful attention on its own. Or indeed, Jesus' teaching of the Lord's Prayer, which we didn't cover at all in depth last time. Just, again, summary, trying to cover as much ground as we can. I think that middle section, least narrative, is arguably the greatest significance. As I already talked about, we Christians, we focus a lot on the Christmas and the Easter, the beginning and the end of the story, as we well should, but I worry that we sometimes skip over all that middle section. That middle section is deeply important to really understanding who Jesus was and is, and what we're supposed to learn, and how we're supposed to actually live as disciples of Jesus in our own lives today. That teaching stuff is crucial to that work. And again, remember that Luke is not writing this as a biography or as a history in the traditional sense. He is not a disinterested viewer of these events. Luke is convinced that the events he's recounting have existential importance for all human beings. Right? He has an axe to grind. I think he's honest about that. He's upfront about that. But we should keep that in mind. This text is about faith-seeking understanding, not about abstract knowledge for the sake of simply knowing more facts about the world. And again, I want to reiterate, and this is, of course, true of what we'll do in the next 2 weeks with Acts. This is all my perspective on Luke. I have chosen to accentuate some things and to de-accentuate other things. And another person teaching the same material might present this rather differently. Of course, that would be fine. So again, feel free to disagree with my presentation or my slant. And again, my hope is that, and go read it and decide for yourself what Luke is really all about and why Luke might be important for us to look at, right? As you hopefully go forth to read Luke closely, some questions that might be worth thinking about tonight and in the days and weeks to come are, is there anything that surprised you about what you heard in my presentation of Luke? Remembering that I left out like 95% of it, really. But is there anything that surprised you? What are some of the things we expect from the New Testament that we don't always find there? There's quite a lot that we think is there that isn't there. There's quite a lot that's there that we didn't expect, because again, we overlook a lot. Is there a section of Luke that you maybe are especially interested in looking at more closely? Might be good to actually start there. Having this narrative overview would mean, for example, that if you wanted to study Luke, you wouldn't necessarily have to begin in chapter 1 and read forward. Because you kind of have this context and narrative, you could drop into one chapter if that interested you more, and you would have enough knowledge. Perhaps you already had enough knowledge, but hopefully now you have enough knowledge to understand what's coming and what has come before to get some meaning out of that. And again, it's my hope that this big picture summary introduction overview will help you make sense of the individual stories, parables, and other lessons. And it might be worth asking, with that context in place, how does that change your interpretation of some of those passages that you did know already, right? Or does it change your understanding? Because perhaps it doesn't. And are there actually any lessons, any applications, anything that you want to take away that might actually change how you behave, how you worship, how you engage in spirituality going forward? Again, Luke is hoping to actually encourage a change in life, a metanoia, a turning of our lives. We can talk about these questions if you want tonight, but you don't need to answer these to me. These are more questions I hope that you'll be asking yourself. And next week, we're going to jump right in to Acts. We'll cover Acts in 2 weeks. So we're going to move, if anything, even faster than we have been moving. Again, a lot will be left out, but I hope that we'll cover the basic narrative. And at the end of our 5th session, I will stop again and we'll do another kind of overview reflection on both Luke and Acts. But as for tonight, that's what I have. Thank you all for being with us. And again, I'm happy to stick around as long as you'd like for questions, comments, conversation, whether you're on Zoom or in person. Thanks for being here, and I'll be here for as long as you want tonight.